Well, hi everybody. Today we come up on a text in our study in the book of Luke that we've been going through that on the one hand I love talking about, but on the other hand I dread talking about. The reason I dread it is because I know going into it that not everyone is going to appreciate or accept the thing that the text teaches, mainly because of preconceived ideas or theologies that they've held tight to for all their life. Theologies like a so-called rapture or the end of the world or the second coming and all these kind of things. Especially in this culture of influential books and movies that have put all kinds of wild theories into people's minds. But because of the vast amount of fascinating information in this text and the way it is misunderstood, misused, and often misapplied, we're going to take about 3 days to work through it together because I don't want to overwhelm you all in one day. But here's the good news. Whatever differences of opinion you may have about the things that we look at, our salvation is not dependent on those opinions. That being said, I want to ask you to not engage in debate online with me or with each other. If you want to ask me a certain question, I'll be more than happy to address it by private messaging or email. Now, another piece of good news is that the primary subject matter of this text is yet another convincing testament that Jesus was exactly who he said he was, because of the precision of the details and the time frame in which he said these things would take place, took place in those time frames. Now the text we come to today is a conversation that takes place between Jesus and 4 of his disciples, at least to start out with 4, maybe more later on. And it is found in Luke 21. Now we know it begins with 4 disciples because in the book of Mark in chapter 13 we see the same conversation. And it even tells us who those disciples are: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. We also find the same conversation in Matthew 24. And for clarity purposes, I'm probably going to refer to the Matthew 24 text more than the Mark or even the Luke text as we work through this. Now, typically I like to stay away from Greek words, even though that's the language that the New Testament was originally written in, because most of the time it just kind of makes a preacher sound more impressive, and it really doesn't come into play when you're talking about some general principles. But in this conversation, there are a few words that make a big difference in how you read the text in Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. So when we get to those particular places, we'll introduce those words. Now before we get into the text, there is an acronym that I want to show you. One that I actually learned early on in studying the scriptures in college, and one that I taught to our people at Corey Zion Church. And it's very easy to remember. It is this: AIM, aim. And as our people can tell you, it simply means author's intended meaning. Whenever you read scripture, one of the hardest things to do is to not bring in your own baggage or preconceived ideas and beliefs into your understanding of the text. We have to first and foremost learn to understand it best as we can, as the original listeners or readers would have understood it. If we don't make every effort to do that, we can make a scripture mean whatever it is we want it to mean. For example, in this conversation, you're going to see that Jesus will use the word you, Y-O-U, you, almost 20 times. Who is the specific you he is referring to first and foremost? The original listeners, which in this case would have been disciples, not people 2,000 years from then or 3,000 years from then. There are principles that we can apply from the text, but the original you are the original listeners, so we have to try to understand it how they would have understood it. Whenever you're searching for the aim or the AIM, the 3 most important words in any conversation is context, context, context. And yes, I said that word 3 times for emphasis. And by context, I mean things such as understanding the general subject at hand by sometimes reading the 4 or 5 verses prior and the 4 or 5 verses after, by doing our best to understanding historical context through the Bible and other resources, and by understanding even how language and certain words or phrases were used in Scripture and or in the culture at the time. Things like this, so on and so forth, are very important when it comes to trying to understand how original listeners might have heard a particular conversation. And again, because if you don't take contexts like these in mind, you can make a text say anything you want it to say. So with that in mind, here's our story. During these last few days of Jesus' life on earth, what we call Passion Week, which we're actually celebrating right now, he and the disciples are going in and out of the temple area. And on one particular occasion, as they are leaving, one of the disciples makes a comment about the magnificent stones and the beauty of the temple area. See, like us, they marveled at architect and technology. And why shouldn't they? It was said that the gold on the top part of the temple could be seen for miles in the sunlight. Listen to how first century historian Josephus describes it. Now the outward face of the temple in its front was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. But the temple, as it appeared to strangers when they were coming into it at a distance, looked like a mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts of it that were not covered with gold, they were exceeding white. The stones that are used to build the foundation of the temple courts were massive. Even today, you can go over to Israel and see one that is 40 feet long, 11 feet tall, and over 15 feet thick, and estimated to weigh as much as 600 tons. That's over 1 million pounds. And bear in mind, these were hauled up and put together on a small mountain long before cranes and bulldozers. So you can understand their fascination, right? So can you imagine then their shock when Jesus responds to this fascination with structures with this statement: "The time will come when not one stone will be left upon another." This is actually the second time Jesus makes this claim. Just a few days earlier, as he was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, he wept over Jerusalem because he foresaw their destruction ahead of time. And at that time, he also said, not one stone will be left upon another. You see, to a first century Jew who was looking at these things, that didn't even seem possible. The only way, especially in a world not of nuclear warheads and missiles, in their minds, the only way that could cause something like that to happen had to be a cataclysmic event such as the end of the earth as we know it. So, when they are alone, the 4 disciples come to Jesus and they ask this question, and this is from Matthew 24. "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age?" Now that question is so critical for a couple of reasons. First, while it appears in English to be 2 questions, it is really one question asked 2 different ways. Because to the disciples, the end of the temple area would have to be simultaneous to the end of the earth. There was no other way they could imagine it coming down. Which brings us to the second critical part. The word that the disciples used when referring to the end of the age is the Greek word thunteleos or thunteleo. Thunteleos or thunteleo. That word, that specific word, means the end of everything as we know it, the end of the world as we see it, the end of the earth. Again, because what else to them could bring down this magnificent structure, so they use the word thunteleio. Now Jesus will answer them, but in doing so, he does something very unique. He changes their mistaken understanding about the end of the temple being simultaneous with the end of the age or the end of the world. Before doing this, though, he begins this answer with a very strong warning to make sure that no matter what else they hear, they don't miss this point. And the warning is, do not let yourself be led astray by others who claim to be Messiah or claim that I have returned. And then he goes on to say, you, and again, who is the you in this conversation? The disciples, right? And by the way, you're going to hear me ask you that question several times. You will hear about wars and rumors of war, but understand that these first must take place, even so the end has not come. Now this is where Jesus makes a dramatic shift in the conversation. Whereas the disciples use the word thunteleia in their question, Jesus uses a different word when he says the word end at this point. He uses the word telos. Telos. Now telos does not mean the end of everything. It means the end of a process or the end of a chain of events or even a section of time. By using this word, Jesus is making a sharp distinction between the event that one stone won't be left upon another and the soon to lay us, the end of the earth. He's kind of taking their question and dividing it in half. They thought it was simultaneous. Jesus is showing here that it isn't. It is so critical to the conversation that we understand that. Now, before we go on, we also need to understand where the bookend of the thing that Jesus will talk about in relation to the telos, or the end of the temple, is. In other words, by bookend, what I mean is, at what point is Jesus finished talking about the circumstances surrounding this telos, this end of the temple event? And that's important because it will shape, once you understand where the end is, it will shape how you read the verses in between the beginning and where that break is. And it will keep you from intermingling the two events, just like the disciples did, when Jesus is really only talking about one event. And Jesus himself makes it very clear where this separation is. In Matthew 24, it is actually in verses 34 and 35, and the Luke chapter 21 is in verses 32 and 33. And both of these kind of read the same way. Here's from Matthew. It says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Again, you have to remember who is the original audience and how would they have understood this. Even today, we talk about generations such as millennials, baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, and we understand in our context that we're talking about roughly a 20-year time frame, give or take. Now, people 1,000 years from now might look back and have to try to study a little bit of the culture to understand what we meant. But we understand what we're talking about when we say those things. In the same way, how would the disciples have understood the term "this generation"? Well, the disciples would have taken that to mean about a 40-year time period. And guess what? Those events that Jesus will talk about actually do take place in 70 AD, which is almost 40 years after this conversation. It became yet another undeniable validation of the trustworthiness of Jesus. And it should come by no surprise, because even by his own words, he said his word will never pass away. That's a way of Jesus saying, you can take that to the bank. Because I said it will happen, you can trust it will happen. And it did. It's great to know that we can take Jesus at his word. We also know that this is a break from the telos conversation because of another very important Greek word. And that term, or that word, is the word peride. Peride means basically a new subject matter. Whenever we see that term in the scriptures, in the Greek version, it means that the writer or the speaker is breaking away from whatever he was just talking about and beginning another topic. It shows up a lot in 1 Corinthians as Paul switches from topic to topic. Now we'll get to verses 36 and beyond that later, but that's where it begins. Where Jesus says in verse 36, peride is translated as the word "but concerning," meaning that Jesus is no longer talking about what he was talking about a verse or two before. He's now talking about something different. But again, we'll get to that a little bit later. So what that means for us now, though, is that everything between verses 4 and 35 in the Matthew 24 text and the Luke 21 text, verses 8 to 33, are all part of the same telos event that he is talking about. But it's absolutely critical that we remember this dividing line, because the two events, the telos and the sunteleia, have entirely different characteristics. The most important of which, now hear me on this, is that Jesus knew when the end of the telos event would take place, when this one stone upon another would happen. He knew exactly what the signs would be that they needed to be aware of. He knew exactly when to tell them to get out of town. But as he will make clear in verses 36 and beyond, he had no idea when the timing of the sunteleio, the end of all things, will happen. At least not at that time he didn't. He will even end his talk on this conversation by saying that he will come like a thief in the night. He said the same thing in Revelation 16. When a thief is going to break into your house, he isn't going to tell you all the warning signs, right? If I told you that I was going to break into your house, but hey, just before I do, you're going to see a solar eclipse, there's going to be a magnolia tree in your front yard that catches fire, and your two neighbors on either side of you are going to have a fist fight in your driveway. Now, as soon as all three of those events took place, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be standing at the door with a gun and a Doberman, knowing that me, the thief, is going to break into your house at any moment because of those signs. Well, a thief doesn't tell you those signs. So as we look in the text a little bit more tomorrow and pick it apart a little bit more detail, it's going to be difficult to keep these things in mind because some of the language that Jesus will use appears to be what we've come to think of and is often misinterpreted as part of the second coming event. And also because in many Bibles there are dividing headlines that lead you to believe that there is a shift in the conversation in spite of the fact that Jesus himself has not made that shift yet. So, I don't want to overwhelm you all in one sitting, but this is just today, we're just kind of a setup for tomorrow and the following day. So I hope you'll join me. Until then, friends, stay safe, stay connected, and stay faithful. See you tomorrow.